Hey everybody, welcome on into the webinar. We're going to get started as is tradition around here about a minute or two after the posted time of 7 p.m. Eastern. We tend to find that with these online events, you get your calendar notification that it started, and then you have to open up the Zoom app, and then it might need to update because you haven't opened it in a few months. And so we like to give everyone a little grace to file in before we really get into the meat of the presentation. But Tori, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Uh, my Wi-Fi crashed moments ago, but you know, the show
Great
must go
timing for it
on.
to come back online. So.
Oh, it has not. I am on my
Oh,
hotspot.
wonderful. Well, hopefully your connection stays stable for us and
I mean,
yeah, hopefully it can go off
I'm
without.
looking pretty good. I think so. I think I'm looking pretty good
Yeah,
in
I
terms of
wouldn't have known if you didn't
clarity.
tell me, so that's a good sign. And I say that as someone who spends an ungodly amount of time on Zoom with Tori on a daily basis. So
It's true.
awesome. We've got some more people filing in. So again, we'll just give everyone until like 7:01, 7:02 before we actually get this thing started.
As is also traditional, we have to compare our outfits, which I would say in this case are pretty similar. Although you're not wearing an IB Experience branded one.
Yeah, for
So,
once we're not wearing the same color, which yeah, for our first time attendees to these webinars, Tori and I somehow almost always manage to accidentally match for these webinars, and today we somehow managed not to.
yes. Although the vibe of the two outfits is very similar, I would say.
True, true.
Hmm.
All right, it's about time for us to get started. So without further ado, welcome on in to our webinar on the Enhanced ACT. Very excited for you all to be joining us. Most of the time, our webinars are geared toward pretty much exclusively students and parents. But for this webinar in particular, because the launch of this new version of the ACT has been so confusing for so many people, I also invited several colleagues in the sort of college prep industry, from high school college counselors to independent college counselors, to come in and join us. So welcome one and welcome all. We're really excited to talk about this topic and get into it. I have two quick caveats before we jump into the meat of the presentation today. And the first of those is, if you have any questions at any point during this presentation, please drop them in the Q&A function or in the chat, and we'll address all questions at the end of the presentation. Second caveat is that this is a new test, and there have been many new developments and kind of subtle changes to the way that ACT has announced things. Their announcement versus reality hasn't sometimes been a little bit disconnected, I'll say, based on the amount of confusion that we're seeing from parents, from counselors, from students. And so everything we say in this presentation is subject to change. This is all based on the most up-to-date information we have. We are proud members of the National Test Prep Association, and I serve on the board there. We've spoken directly with ACT representatives about this test. We've gotten the information straight from the horse's mouth to the extent that we can. But it is new, it is changing. So just keep in mind, these are the latest developments as we understand them. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the end all be all and that this will always be the way it is. So with all that out of the way, let's jump on in. And I'll kick it off to Tori to tell us what is actually changing with this new version of the ACT.
Yes. So as Jim kind of alluded to, another grand tradition in test prep is that whenever there's a new test or something is changing, there are many myths and legends that begin to occur. So ultimately, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of all of this, but there are really only three major changes that are happening here. The first one is that the ACT will have a digital option. The paper option will still be available, so this is not like the SAT where it was all happening at once and there was no way to get out of it. Um, there will be an optional science, the science section, which will continue to be this pretty much the same as it always has been, but it will become optional. There's an asterisk on this slide for a reason, which we'll get to later. And the test overall will be shorter, and there will be more time per question. So there'll be slightly more questions on the test that are experimental field test items, which means there are tests options that aren't going to be scored. However, there won't be that fifth section at the end that some students used to get that was all experimental questions. So there are benefits and drawbacks to that particular point.
Yeah, I will say, as far as ACT is concerned, this is a much better way to test questions because students knew that the fifth section didn't count, and that meant that you weren't necessarily getting a student's best effort on every question.
Yeah.
Whereas now they won't know which sections or which questions within a section are experimental. So hopefully ACT will generate some more reliable data that way.
Yes.
So let's talk about the planned timeline for this test. So, one thing that we've seen is a lot of people believing that the ACT is going to this new version of the test where it's digital for everyone in April of this spring. And that is untrue. So, the ACT is going to the new format of the test, which you're going to hear us refer to as the enhanced ACT throughout the presentation. That new format will be available in the digital or online version of the ACT starting in April. However, that doesn't mean that everyone will take it that way. In fact, almost no one will take it that way this April. More on that in a moment. September of 2025, which is to say, fall of next school year, that's when all tests taken on the national test dates, which is to say when you sign up to take it on a Saturday or Sunday at a local school or college or community center that hosts it, and all international tests will go to this new enhanced ACT format, whether you take it on paper or on a computer. And then spring of 2026 is when the enhanced ACT comes to what we call school day testing or state and district testing. And what that means is essentially a school can choose to contract with ACT for ACT to offer the test during the school day to all of their students. Some states contract with ACT to offer the ACT during the school day to all students in the state. In some states, this is even a graduation requirement. Just as an example, if you live in Illinois, your student will take the ACT in the course of their high school experience. But that is not going to be relevant to everyone. Most students don't have the option for school day testing. But however, if you are from a state where everyone takes a school day test or your school offers a school day test, you should know that the school day test next fall will still be in the current ACT format, the old ACT, or what they call the legacy ACT, and we'll use that name as well, up until spring of 2026. So, the first and most important thing I can tell you in this presentation, and this is especially true for our junior families in here, the ACT will not be digital in April. And what I mean by that is that while the ACT has given test centers, which is to say high schools, local community centers, and colleges, the option to host the ACT digitally starting in this April, almost no one has opted to do it. And that's because ACT originally had no BYOD, which is what we call bring your own device program. So on the digital SAT, students can bring their own computer or their school Chromebook, even a tablet potentially, or at least an iPad, and they can take the test on that device that they provide themselves. And schools have some tech support where they can help students out, but really it's on students to make sure that the technology is going to work properly. And it's a big, heavy lift on College Board's part to make that bring your own device policy a reality. From ACT's standpoint, they looked at the technical requirements for bring your own device up front in this process and said, let's try to launch this digital test without a bring your own device policy. Well, I don't know of any high schools that have, I don't know, 100 plus computers just laying around not used for students to be able to all test on the ACT. And I know of even fewer high schools who, if they had those 100 devices laying around, would want to be renting them out to strangers on a Saturday for anyone in the country who just signed up to take the ACT at that high school on that day. All of which is to say, pretty much no high school has offered to host the ACT digitally because to them, it's a lot of headache compared to offering the paper test for no additional reward. I mean, their students are still going to get the opportunity to take the ACT. They just take it on paper instead of a computer. So because of that, for practical purposes, I mean, we don't have a single student that I know of who's testing digitally in April. If you're one of our students and you are testing digitally in April, please let me know because I'd be very curious for your feedback after you take the test. But I mean, I saw there were three test centers in all of New Jersey that offered it and, a handful in Pennsylvania. So it's really not an option for your typical student. And there probably isn't even going to be one within, however many miles you're willing to travel on test day. So all of this is to say that this spring, in the April, the June, and the July testing windows, the ACT will not be digital, and the paper version of the ACT isn't changing yet. So we're seeing a strong misconception from families who think that, oh, anyone who signs up for the ACT in April is taking a digital version of the test. And that's just not true. Almost no one who's testing in April, as a percentage of the population, will be taking this test digitally. So keep in mind that you're not forced into the new version of the test, juniors, until September of senior year. Now, all students will take the enhanced ACT starting in September of 2025. And that means that every test during the fall of your senior year juniors would be in this new ACT format. And more in terms of advice on that in a moment. For anyone in here who's a sophomore or younger, all of your ACTs from junior year on will be in the new format, whether you're taking paper or digital. And for you guys, the main thing to just keep in mind is that it's going to be really hard to find a digital test date because the schools, again, just aren't opting to host it. ACT does hope to eventually implement a bring your own device policy, but they have no timeline for when that will actually be the case. So current sophomores, I can't even say if, by the end of your senior year, it would be a realistic option. We just have no insight into their kind of technological timeline. And that's not the kind of information they share. So we just have to wait and see. Hopefully at one point they announce it so students have the flexibility. But honestly, we'd probably prefer you test on paper for a variety of reasons. We could probably cover that in the Q&A. So juniors, in summary, if you plan to be finished with all of this by July of 2025, you do not need to worry about the digital ACT. I would go so far as to say, and I probably shouldn't say this, my partners who work in marketing with me will probably be upset, but you can close out of the webinar if you are guaranteed pretty much to be done by July of 2025, because this new test just doesn't even affect you. If your testing timeline makes it likely that you're going to test in September, October, or December of your senior year, then definitely stay tuned because you're going to want to know about these changes that are coming in the pipeline. Um, and then for sophomores, just know all of your tests are going to be in this new version. Now, when we talk about the new ACT and the science section being optional, there is actually currently an optional section of the ACT, the writing section. It's been optional for a very long time. I want to say since about 2018 or so, though I'd have to double check myself on that. It wasn't optional when I started in this field, and it is optional now. The optional writing section isn't really used by any colleges at all. And when I say that, I don't say it's optional at a lot of colleges. I say, like, if you submit it, they don't care. So it's really not used. Whereas that's not what we're seeing in science. More on that in a moment. But the legacy ACT essentially had these four sections of English, math, reading, and science. And then you had optional writing. And the new version of the test is essentially taking that science section and now making that optional along with the writing. So when we say science is optional, essentially your overall ACT score, we call it the composite score. It's scored out of 36, and only English, math, and reading will make up that composite score. Science is going to be reported as its own separate score out of 36. So whereas now they're all four are scored out of 36 and your average of all four is your composite score. In the future, it's going to be a composite score out of 36 and then the science section reported separately. So if you choose to submit the science score, schools seem to be willing to still review it. But if you choose not to take the science section, that's an option you have. However, um, anyone who's listened to any webinar where we've talked about test optional knows that the word optional exists on a spectrum. And optional doesn't always mean totally optional. And so I want to talk about two case studies, which are two of kind of what I'd consider the biggest names in college admissions to have released their policy publicly on the science section of the ACT. First is Stanford, one of the most selective and competitive schools in the country. And they have made a strong statement that the science section will be optional. They have said in their announcement that they understand that, especially during this rollout period, students may not really have a choice between which of the versions of the tests that they take. They may not have an option to take science. So juniors, that means that they have no preference for whether you take the test with or without the science section. So they've said that. How true that will be, we're going to have to wait for years of admissions data to see because we saw during test optional that colleges sometimes said one thing and their actions indicated something a little different. We'll wait and see there. I also want to point out the Bright Futures Scholarship Program. So the Bright Futures Program exists only in the state of Florida, and it's for Florida residents to get scholarships, very large scholarships to Florida State public schools, and smaller scholarships available to Florida State private schools. I mentioned Bright Futures because it's one of the most well-known and well-used merit scholarship, programs in the country, and is heavily based on GPA and test scores, mandatory GPA and test scores. So Bright Futures has come out and said that the science section will remain mandatory, at least for the class of 2026, which is the last class year that they have released all of their kind of documentation and requirements for. So this is sort of the pattern that we saw with test optional admissions during the pandemic when everyone had to go test optional. A lot of colleges, they went test optional for admissions, but they actually remained test mandatory for some of their internal merit-based scholarships. And it looks our early returns, most colleges again haven't publicly said anything about the new version of the ACT, but our early returns here seem to suggest that colleges will make it optional and give students the freedom and flexibility to test in the way that they see best. And then merit scholarships seem to prefer continuing to have the science section. Again, these are very early returns. It's two data points. As a friend of mine likes to say, the plural of anecdote is not data. So we're definitely going to be keeping our ear to the ground and, trying to understand as more information comes out about what colleges are saying and requiring, what different scholarship programs are saying and requiring, what is going to make the most sense for most people. The one kind of short version that I'll tell you is I recommend taking the science section for two main reasons. One is that it opens you up to the most options. So you have more options in front of you while taking the science section. Two is that we tend to find in our data and in our practice as tutors that science is often one of the most coachable sections for students. So even a student who comes in and is feeling very uncomfortable and scoring low in ACT science, if they have the underlying academic skills, which by the way are mostly not science related, more math and kind of data analysis, quantitative skills, um, then you can learn to take that section and take it very effectively. We see a lot of our biggest improvements across the four sections of the ACT in science and English. And so we wouldn't want students to give up that chance to really improve their score. So for most students, it's going to make sense to still take the science section. I'm sure, we're a one-on-one tutoring company and we do it that way because there are no one-size-fits-all solutions in this world. So there certainly will be students out there who, for them, the work that it would take to prepare for the science section is not worth the output that they would get in terms of their score. And for some students, we may end up recommending that they choose not to take the science section, but we need a lot more information about college policies and a lot more evidence that it's going to be widespread and available to submit your ACT score without science and not be at a disadvantage before we're really willing to recommend students don't take the science section. And with that, I'll pass it off to Tori to talk a little more. I've been focusing kind of outside in on the situation surrounding the test. Tori's going to take us inside this test and what is actually changing. So go ahead.
Yes. So the biggest change I would say for an actual test taker on this test is that it's going to be a shorter and less speeded test. So speeded is a word that we test nerds use that just means that feeling of needing to rush through and take the test more quickly and do each individual question more quickly. That's going to be alleviated at least somewhat. So the ACT will be overall 44 questions shorter, and each section of the test will offer more time per question. We'll be seeing the actual data on this in a couple of slides. This eh, it's all to say that the individual sections have a pretty wide range of how much this is going to affect them, but each section will have more time per question. Also, that experimental fifth section that we were alluding to earlier, which was the one that students always knew didn't count, and I had many students just tell me they wanted to put their heads down during it and not do it at all. They're eliminating that altogether, and they're going to be putting between 2 to 3 experimental questions per section. That number may go up or down. That's probably the piece of information, well, of several pieces of information that ACT has been pretty cagey about. They'll throw a number out and then change it, but we're thinking it'll be somewhere around there, which is about what the SAT has as well. And that's going to be the situation. So is the actual data on this test. So right now, we can see about a 30, sorry, I got a little bit confused here. So if you take the test without the science, you'll be taking a test that's about 50 minutes shorter overall. If you take the test with the science, the test will only be about 5 minutes shorter. But again, it's a 5 minute shorter test with 44 fewer questions. So that's a really big improvement, I would say. And that is definitely the piece of feedback that we get the most often about the ACT is that people feel really rushed through it. They have a really hard time finishing. So this will also be a significant change in how we decide diagnostically what students should be taking, because that was always a major difference between the two exams. And here is the actual percentage difference. So this is sort of what I was speaking about earlier. Um, you can see here that the math will have the smallest um, increase in time per question at about 12%, and the reading will have the biggest by far at 28% increase of time per question.
It's also, I think, worth noting that the math section tends to be the section where time matters the least for most students. And that's because of a feature of the math section where the questions go from easier to harder. And
Mhm.
so you often have students running out of time for the very hardest questions on the test that they were most likely to get wrong anyway. So the time
Yes.
impacts their scores less, even though it doesn't feel good as a tester to be running out of time. You're still, if you
Yes.
end up getting your 1/4 or 1/5 chance on your random guesses, then you're not hurting yourself as much by not answering a question that you were quite likely to get wrong than you are on the earlier questions where you're much more likely to get them right. And in
Yes.
the rest of the sections, they don't progress that same way in difficulty. So, missing out on the last 5 English questions, for instance, would hurt you much more because you have the same probability of getting those right as the first 5.
Yes. So overall, we do anticipate that this experience of taking the test is going to be a much improved one for most students. Um, Primarily because that was the big pain point, is the feeling of feeling really rushed. So the actual content changes are both, they seem kind of big, but are really overall actually quite minor, I would say. So on the English section, they're adding in an argumentative passage, which they didn't have previously. I would argue this is probably the least impactful of all the changes because students don't really notice what kind of passage they're reading anyway on the English, so it doesn't really matter, but that is something they're doing. They're also adding in what are called question stems on all the questions. There'll be a photo of this in a later slide, but what that means is there'll be an actual question for each English question as opposed to before where they just sort of had 4 options and you had to pick the one that was best for that circumstance, but you weren't ever, well, some students were having a hard time deciding what the question was actually asking. So that should be a little bit more clear. And then overall, the English section will have shorter passage lengths. Again, I don't really think this is going to impact the actual student experience at all because the passage length doesn't really matter for the English section. But that might be nice for them. And then also on the virtual version of the test, they will be highlighting key question phrases for ease of reading. So that means it's going to be a little bit harder to get lost about where you're supposed to be looking. On the math section, the big change here that is kind of blowing the test prep minds everywhere is that there's only going to be four options. So all the other sections have four options currently for answer choices, and the math has always had five, and now there will be four. So for the normal person, this is again probably not that big of a deal. For Jim and I, we're steeped in this all the time. This was major news. um, Also, there are going to be overall fewer of the lowest level questions. If you think about this, this makes a good amount of sense. The test has to stay relatively the same difficulty for it to keep being valid, basically. So, in order for it to maintain the same difficulty while being less speeded, as we were saying before, you have to sort of take away some of those easier questions. Also, something that should improve the test taking experience here is that there are going to be shorter word problems. So the ACT is kind of known for being pretty verbose, and they're really trying to pare that down. So you can see here what I was talking about with the highlighted phrases. So you can see that each of these underlined questions or each of the underlined portions of this passage are going to have their own question. But when you get to that question on the virtual version of the test, they'll just sort of highlight the part that you're supposed to be looking at just so you don't get lost. And then here is an example of the question stem situation. So on the right-hand side is the new version of the test, and you can see here that it says which choice makes the sentence most grammatically acceptable. And you've got our four options here. And on the legacy version of the test or the current version, each of these is just sort of presenting the answer choices, and you have to sort of make your own mind up about exactly what they're asking for. Um, so that likely will be much more of a change in terms of how we teach rather than how the test is actually experienced, but it is good to know. And then here is our our big bombshell math situation with our five question options on the right on the left hand side and our four question options on the right hand side. Which again, this is not that important, but it is still very exciting for us. Another late breaking addition here is that you can see that on the left hand side it goes from F to K on some of the questions. About half of them, well, not even about half of them have F to K. They're doing away with F to K. It's only going to be A, B, C, and D for every question. So I suppose that's probably not exciting to any of you, but again, for nerds, very exciting.
Yeah.
The readings, the reading section will be almost exactly the same as it is now. However, the passages are going to be shorter overall, so that's going to be helping with that speededness situation, and that it's going to take a little bit less time to read the passages. There will be the same number of passages, however, so that part won't be changing. Overall, I wouldn't expect that to feel much different for the students, although, as we said, the actual time per question is increasing the most on this section, so that will be a big change. And then on science, there's going to be one passage per test that addresses a design or engineering topic. And hypothetically, there are going to be more science knowledge questions. They have released one practice exam so far, and it didn't actually have more science knowledge questions, but that is what they have said. So we did want to bring it up.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that that's been kind of a slow trend, I would say, over the last 10 years,
Hmm.
that they have kind of slowly implemented more of those science knowledge questions. So when they announced that there would be more of them, they might just be saying we're going to continue the same slow trend. In general,
Yeah.
ACT has been slow to make changes. So College Board, every once in a while, they just burn their test to the ground and recreate it like a phoenix from the ashes. But the ACT makes changes gradually over time. They do a national curriculum review I forget if it's every 2 or every 4 years, and then they realign their test
Sure.
content with that curriculum review based on what
Hmm.
is actually being taught in US high schools. And so we've seen trends and changes over time, but it's been more gradual. And frankly, that has held true with this redesign as well, where even reps from ACT are saying content-wise, the questions you're being asked and the knowledge you need is about 90% the same. Whereas we would not have
Yes.
said that about the new SAT at all. That was a
No.
big change in test format.
Yes. So although these test things do seem kind of drastic in some ways, you can sort of see by the way that I've been talking about it and the way that you probably have been able to read on about it on your own, the changes are much more gradual than most people have anticipated.
Yeah. Now, one change to the ACT is that they're changing the name of the TIR. The TIR is also called the tutor's best friend. It's when a student can take the ACT on some of the test dates each year, three of them to be precise, and then they can get an actual copy of their test along with what they selected for each question and what the right answer is. So it's the best way to review with your tutor what your actual performance was on test day and really dig in and make sure that you're fine-tuning things in the best possible way for your next test. They're changing the name to ACT My Answer Key, but they are going to be offering it for the digital test. And this is something we were worried about because College Board's comparable service, which they called QAS or Question and Answer Service, they did away with in the era of digital testing and have said that, they're not going to be offering it. And that is technically illegal in some states. And they've just responded to that they're going to just challenge those laws in court because they believe they were written for a bygone era and don't apply to an era of computer testing. If you want to hear me rant about that, we can set up a separate meeting, but that's all I'll say for now. The ACT's My Answer Key service is going to be the new name of the TIR, but students will still 3 times a year get to actually see the questions they got, what they missed, and then, learn from that and study for their next test date. One strange thing about it is because there are so many experimental questions. Of course, experimental questions are designed for inclusion on future official tests. And that means that they will not be releasing the experimental questions with the ACT My Answer Key. Instead, they'll be essentially filling in dummy questions for the experimental questions. So that, in other words, people like us could still use these copies of the tests as practice tests for our students, and students can still use them as practice tests for themselves, but they're not kind of giving away these questions that they tested and compromising the security and validity of their tests that way. So it's a kind of common sense compromise on their part but it also means that a student who took the test, if you're like, man, there was this one question that asked me like how many apples Johnny ate versus Sally, and I really, thought I got stumped by that one. If you don't see it in your ACT My Answer Key, then that means it was experimental and you can wipe the sweat from your brow because it's not going to count against you that you had to guess on that one. Um, the the other thing I'll say is that it gives you your kind of a way to take you from the number of questions you got right to your actual score out of 36. And what that means is that students can kind of see like, oh, if I'd gotten one more question right in science, I could have gone from, a 27 to a 28 and things like that. So you will still get that information with it. Um, and then this is often not offered on school day testing. In fact, we mostly not, and the same with Sunday testing. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so I just want to review before we hop into the Q&A here, and you'll notice we left like half the time for Q&A because we thought that's how things might shake out tonight. But juniors, my advice to you is to do your best to be done with the ACT by July so you don't have to worry about any of this. And then if you do end up having to test in the fall, because that's how things laid out with your schedule, or you didn't do quite as well in your spring testing as you'd hoped to, I would advise that you, first of all, make sure you're adjusting your prep and prepping for the version of the test that you're actually going to see. And second of all, you should really be viewing this as an opportunity, not an obstacle. And what I mean by that is that if you tested, 2, 3 times this spring and you're still not happy with your score, it could be that, ACT shaking things up and making the test format a little different helps you more than it hurts you. If the test is going to be over 90% similar, and you've been preparing for that version of the test, building the knowledge and the skills to do well on it, then by the time it rolls around, it might be a good thing that it's just a little different because maybe that'll help you unlock that extra 1, 2 points that you're looking for. For my sophomores, so diagnostic testing is always step one in this process to figure out if SAT or ACT is the right fit for you. But we don't have a practice test yet in the new ACT format. I saw that question in the Q&A, so I'll just head it off right now because it's relevant. ACT has released a practice test. You can tell from my tone of voice there that it's not really a practice test. It doesn't contain scoring information. So in other words, it's a list of questions that is in the format of the new test and the number of questions and time limit of the new test that students can try, and it will correct your answers, but it won't actually give you a score. So it is the best thing out there right this second for students to get a feel for the digital version of the ACT or the enhanced ACT in any format. And for anyone, especially juniors who are taking it this spring, I'd advise that you get after that practice test and really get in there, try it, see what you're missing, develop your prep plan. But sophomores, you should wait because ACT has said that they're going to have a test that will actually be scored by the end of February. Um, They've missed deadlines in the past. We hope they hit this one. If they don't, I feel pretty good that they'll have it by your spring break. So I usually recommend spring break as kind of the ideal time during 10th grade to take diagnostic testing anyway, because when you take it over spring break, you're close to the summer, and a lot of our students are going to start preparing that summer before junior year. So it gives you kind of a 2 month runway to get your plan in order, figure out your test date, count backwards, figure out when you need to start prep, and then start executing on that. So we should still get the test in time for you to do the diagnostic testing by spring break. So stay tuned. If you're interested in that diagnostic test, if we've already talked, you're already on my list. But basically, every 10th grade family I talk to now, I got a long list of people where right when we get this scoreable new ACT, I'm going to be sending out emails to all of you. And if you want to be on that list, then just email us at info@myivexperience.com. You can also text us at our office number or call, and we'd be happy to set you up with it as well. But I do recommend it as a common sense first step in this process, just to make sure you're investigating both tests and picking the right one for you. So with that, we're going to hand it over to Q&A. Okay, we've got a question here. Will a student be able to send only the science score and withhold the composite? I believe, and this isn't 100% certain on my part, but I believe you can't send the composite without science or send science without the composite if you took both on the same day. You're sending that whole test date. And that mirrors the current situation with writing as well. So if you took writing that day, it goes with your composite score. The other thing I'll say about this and all scoring questions in general, and I happen to know that the gentleman who asked this question, hello, Sigis, he knows this already, but colleges in their admissions offices, they use a software that displays custom information. So the college gets to decide what their kind of heads up display for their admissions officers is. That means if a college super scores the ACT, they can choose to just show that super score in the interface that their admissions officers actually see. And so it's very rare that a student, would that an admissions officer would look at the other scores of a student if that college super scores. But technically speaking, the admissions officers have access to that, super score and all of the section scores from it, but they're very rarely actually going to engage with it. But it seems to be the case that you're not going to be able to withhold science if you take it, just like you can't withhold writing if you take it now. All right. Another question, if students register for the April, June, or July test dates, will they be taking the legacy ACT or the enhanced version on paper? And it will be the legacy ACT on paper through July. So students are taking the same old ACT it's ever been through July if they're testing on paper. All right, another question. Any feedback from ACT as to whether a student can send the composite score and withhold the science section? Oh, this is the other question that you were referencing. Yeah, so this one's already been addressed. You can't split your scores. If you test on one day, they get everything from that day if you share anything from that day. What materials will be available for the new test and when will they be available? Great question. So we've addressed the practice testing. We've got the unscorable practice test and some sample questions up on ACT's website now. I'll be sure to include a link to that in the follow-up email that I send to all of our attendees today. So look out for that by the end of the week. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that ACT publishes what we call the Red Book, which is their official practice book that has practice tests included. And that Red Book is, I believe, scheduled to be available by May, as at last that I heard. So scheduled to be available again, I mean, it's all promises and words are wind, but we will see. Uh, I wish I had more detailed of an answer for you, but hopefully by May we'll actually get the official ACT prep guide. And once ACT starts releasing practice tests that have actual scoring, the other thing is that's when we'll start to see third-party tests proliferate from other providers. So keep that in mind as well. Another question. For juniors who take the digital in April, will the composite include science as it currently does, or will science be separate as in the new way of scoring? If they're taking the digital ACT in April, that means it's the new enhanced ACT, and that means science won't be part of the composite score. Composite will be the average of English, reading, and math, and then what we'll get science as a separate score out of 36 in that case. All right, a couple other questions. How will super scoring change between the new and the old test? Can you mix and match scores from the legacy and the new test? And a related question, can you still super score? Very good question. And so there are a lot of technicalities involved in this kind of question that I'm actually going to skip right past because what actually matters is what colleges decide to do with the scores. Now, technically speaking, from ACT's standpoint, you cannot super score with the science section. You cannot super score from ACT's perspective from a test with the science section and without. In other words, when you send like the super score report, the science section wouldn't factor into a super score. But I believe English reading and math could be super scored
Yeah.
if you took one of each version.
Mhm. That's what they
Um,
said at this
yeah,
conference for sure.
but what really matters is what colleges do, not what ACT does with their paperwork. Because again, colleges get all of this data and then they feed it into a program that displays it in the way they want their admissions officers to see it. So if colleges say, actually, we want to keep, doing four section super scoring or something like that, I mean, they can do whatever they want. Often I think they'll follow ACT's guidance, but technically speaking, they can do kind of whatever they want. I would encourage you to just think a little bit more holistically about the scores that you're sending to colleges. And if, basically the question with super scoring is, does it improve your application to send more than one test date? Right? And I know this is a bit of a wishy-washy answer, and I'm sorry I don't have a better one for you. If you do test prep with us, I advise families on this kind of thing all the time. So when it comes time to send scores, send me an email like, hey, I'm not sure whether to do this or that. I'll advise you on your specific situation. But you really just have to think, is a single test date where I did better a better reflection of me, or the super score where I did better in some sections, not quite as well in others, along with that other test state, going to improve my standing with the school. And if a college says they super score, they mean it. I often hear the question from families, um, you know, well, can't they see your lower scores when you send the super score? It's like super scoring is not some like secret gotcha policy. They're not trying to
Yeah.
trick you into sending your lowest scores so that they can keep you out. If they say they super score, they mean we've decided that evaluating a student's best score in each section is the best way to understand the kind of student they'll be on campus, which is the whole point of standardized testing in the first place. There are actually, and there always have been, a few schools out there that ask you to send all of your test scores. And they don't say that they super score, right? So Georgetown, famous example, they ask you to send all of your scores. They don't call it super scoring. Georgetown wants to see the bad ones too, is basically what they're saying with that policy. Whereas colleges that super score say, we think that your best scores in each section are going to give us the most information and the best way to evaluate you. So, yeah, all of this is to say that the logistics of super scoring get very complicated across the test because it's just different versions and, does it include science, does it not? But the decision is actually, I think, a little more straightforward than people give it credit for. It's just, do you have higher section scores with multiple test dates or one? And that's pretty much how I'm going to be, helping families to make the decision along the way. All right. Thank you all so much for attending. Really appreciate it. I know this stuff is confusing. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any more questions. We love talking about this in case you couldn't tell from this presentation. So happy to speak with any family, happy to speak with any, school counselors, any independent counselors who are still confused by all of this, and how to best advise your students. And really wishing you all a great night and a great rest of the week. And expect a recap email from me with the YouTube link for this presentation in case you want to share it with anyone who wasn't able to be here tonight. We put on these webinars to be free and open to the public. And we've seen a lot of widespread confusion about this test. The more people we can spread this to and hopefully alleviate a little bit of that, the better. So please do spread it far and wide. And yeah, we'll be here for your questions.
Yep. And particularly if you have any questions about if one of your students has a learning difference, or you have questions about the new accommodations on the ACT, because I know that that has also been pretty confusing for many of my students. I'm the accommodation specialist on staff, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions about that stuff, or really anything. But so you can always just shoot us an email at our info@myexperience.com or give us a call, and that call will be directed to me if that's the kind of question that you have.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night, and hopefully we'll hear from you soon.
Bye.